Hello, welcome everybody to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Testers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very many reasons. And joining me today, and I think probably pretty much every week from now on, if all goes well, Marie Moran. Am I saying it right?
It's Morin.
Moran. Dang it, I said it. You said Moran was how it's sometimes pronounced by other family. Marie Moran. Who is one of our executive functioning coaches at Effective Artistry. And we're very excited to have you joining us.
Happy to be here. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I like doing this with somebody else a lot more than doing it alone, for sure. And you and I always have such interesting conversations. So I'm glad that we're able to do this on stream for everybody. I don't know if anybody will be here today because I don't know that we announced the shift very well, but that's okay. So we are now going to be streaming the This Is Not Therapy Hour every Monday from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Central Time. What time is that for you?
So British summertime ended yesterday, so that's 6 p.m. UK time.
Yeah, so you can see we do a lot of like time zone math around here. But yeah, every week at this time, and we're going to try and make it so that these things rebroadcast at least on Wednesday at the 1 o'clock time that we had been doing for the past year and a half. I don't know how long since we started it, but probably also some other times as well. Every week we pick a theme, a topic to discuss, just to kind of make it so that we have some questions and some things to go on. But those of you who are here, if you're here in the chat, you take priority. This is a conversation. So the things that Marie and I are going to say, hopefully, if you're paying attention, you'll hear them. It'll impact you and what you're thinking and doing. The things that you write in the chat, we'll see them and it will impact us and what we're thinking and doing. So we'll go wherever we go. But we'll start with a topic, which we have for today, but we'll get to that in a second because I'm trying to remember all my things to say. And I think the one I forgot is Effective Artistry is a small therapy and executive functioning coaching practice. We have therapists that do individual, couples, family, group therapy. And we have executive functioning coaches like the wonderful Marie here, who do executive functioning coaching work. And we've talked about that in the past. And I'm sure we'll talk about it again now that we've got you on the stream at some point. We can get more into the details for people again. Yeah, I don't know. Am I missing anything? I don't know if you can think of anything important that I should be saying that I'm not saying.
I guess that we can work with anyone, no matter where you are in the world, as long as you have an internet connection.
That's true. Yeah. So for therapy, our office is in Illinois, Northbrook, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. So for therapy, we can only work with people in the state of Illinois. Our executive functioning coaches can work with people all over the place. We've worked with people from India, Thailand, Africa. I shouldn't have said 2 countries and then a continent, Zimbabwe. All over the place. And Marie, you're in Scotland, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Originally from Ireland, though.
That's right.
Yeah, so coaching is worldwide, all done online. Okay.
I think that's everything.
Yeah, all right. We'll get that nailed in. At some point I should like actually write up a little list for myself of the things that I need to say. But today, our topic, and I'm going to have Marie, you're going to tell us all what our topic is and start throwing some questions out there. In fact, I'm going to full screen. I love having it full screen, but I never do that because I want to make sure to be able to see all the chat. But if I'm missing anything, you'll let me know.
For sure. All right. So today's topic, a few people asked about this, is emotional regulation or dysregulation. So this is something that comes up presumably in therapy as well as coaching. So I guess I would just start with the basics. What is emotional regulation and emotional dysregulation?
Yeah, so, we talk all the time about different theorists on executive function will break it down in different ways, break it into subcategories, subfunctions in different ways. It just depends on whatever someone thinks is most useful. But emotional regulation is quite frequently one of the subcategories of executive function. So roughly, broadly, emotional regulation just means having an ability to control your emotions to some extent, right? When you're completely emotionally regulated, it means that both the emotion that you're feeling and the way in which you're expressing that emotion are what you want to be feeling and how you want to be expressing it. Whereas emotional dysregulation is when those things get out of your control. So usually that's accompanied with some intensity, right? Like usually when people are experiencing emotional dysregulation, it's because the emotions they're feeling are very intense. But it doesn't necessarily have to be intense emotion. It just means I'm aware of my emotions or the things that I'm expressing emotionally, and I want to stop it or change it, but I can't. That's dysregulation.
So yeah, you've kind of covered my next question, was how do you measure or quantify it? I guess it varies from person to person, right? Like
Yeah,
how you feel rather than
for sure. Yeah.
you can't measure it.
I mean, all this stuff, really everything in the DSM, all the things we're talking about, they're behavioral, which means they're incredibly multivariate. They're not like medical diagnoses, right? Or symptoms where we can say like, okay, we want your glucose to fall within this range. This is the normal range. And if it's getting up here, then it's a little too high. If it's down here, it's a little too low. This stuff is all purely based on self-report, right? I could be screaming and shouting and still say that I'm emotionally regulated if I'm choosing to scream and shout. You know, I feel as though I could stop myself, but I want to behave that way. So it's not about the behavior, it's about whether or not you have a sense that you're controlling the behavior, or could if you wanted to. And yeah, it's very fluid. It's not something that can really be quantified. Kind of the same way you'd say like any emotion, right? If I say you're happy, how do we quantify that? Or I'm happy, how do I quantify that? It's a subjective experience.
Yeah. You mentioned the DSM. I was listening to a podcast earlier, and they just happened to mention that for ADHD, emotional dysregulation isn't listed in the diagnostic criteria. But from talking to other people with ADHD, it seems that it's a really common issue. Yeah. So my next question that we have here is, what personality traits or diagnoses do you see that are mostly related to experiencing emotional dysregulation?
See, this is why I'm glad you're here, Marie, because I have a tendency to get big and philosophical and esoteric with questions because I want to answer them like precisely, you know, and none of the language is precise. So I'll have to like qualify things, and you can help rein me in a little bit. Because
I'll try, but I enjoy when you get philosophical.
the thing is, like, personality traits, as an example, is not something that I generally like to talk about a lot because they're useful constructs, like they're valid constructs in the way that all of this is. It's useful language to have to be able to convey to somebody, oh, I'm shy, or I'm outgoing, or I am risk taking. I don't know what else. What personality thing? I'm empathetic. I am whatever, right? I know like the big 5-factor personality model is a more common one these days. But
What's the 5?
I don't think I could rattle off. It's openness to new experiences, introversion or extroversion, I think, is one of them. I can't remember what all 5 of them are. I don't put a lot of stock in personality models, just generally. I've heard them referred to humorously, and I like this, as astrology for corporate types.
So like Myers-Briggs test and that kind of thing.
Yeah, which Myers-Briggs test has some very interesting history behind it. If anybody is interested to go look that up, the 2 women who developed the Myers-Briggs test, not the best.
Oh, okay. That's a little rabbit hole for me to jump down later.
Well, look, this is part of what. So as a way of conceptualizing yourself or somebody else, you know, for us to communicate, obviously being able to use personality terms is a very useful thing to talk about. Once we start to bring that in the domain of like, no, there are officially 6 different personality types, or 16, or whatever different amount, and we can categorize people in this way, and we can identify which one you belong to through some kind of assessment, and then we can make predictions about how you'll respond to things, then we're just getting into all the kind of stuff that's rooted in eugenics, just straight up rooted in eugenics. Ways of dividing people up like that based on subjective responses, right? And then making some claim as though it has some meaning. So shy, for example. Yes, people can be shy, of course. And no matter how shy you are, there are times in which you are not behaving in a way that we would expect of somebody who we would term shy. There are times where you're going to be fine talking to people, depending on the people and the context and what you're talking about. So it's a useful shorthand. But when we start to get into matching it with like symptoms and diagnostic criteria, then it starts to get into this wonky pseudoscience kind of place. But having said all that, and especially talking about neurodiversity, certainly we observe patterns of people that it seems useful to say, I experience things intensely, whether that's emotion, whether that's like for ADHD people, focus, right? That big swings from one end of the spectrum of hyperfocus, hyperfixation to the other, where I can sit down and get myself to pay attention to something.
Yeah.
So that intensity, people come up with all these different highly sensitive person, for example, or type 5 on the Enneagram, I believe, is the one that's like the super empathic, etc. Intensity, big feelings, whatever. There seem to be some people who experience that more often than other. How can we say? I don't know. Definitely seems to be a correlation with neurodivergence generally. So autism for sure. I mean, one of the diagnostic criteria for autism is, they don't use this word in the DSM, but is stimming, which is a self-regulatory behavior, right? Another diagnostic criteria is meltdown, which is definitely an experience of emotional dysregulation. ADHDers tend to have this too, not in the criteria, but based on self-report. And really just kind of across the board, honestly, things like OCD, bipolar, borderline personality disorder, anything where you're getting a lot of swings, what we would call emotional lability, Lability, not ability. How much, how frequently, how quickly, how intensely your emotional state seems to shift. So anybody that's more emotionally labile, we would be talking about emotional dysregulation. That was a long-winded way to getting to that answer. I'm not even sure it's a satisfactory answer. What do you think?
No, I think so. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm just thinking back to my own assessment and diagnosis journey. And prior to being diagnosed with ADHD, I had self-diagnosed with a whole bunch of other things because emotional dysregulation was a big part of my experience. So I had gone to my doctor to ask if maybe I was bipolar. And I had been looking up borderline personality disorder, but it turned out it was ADHD. So so
those two, borderline and bipolar, and then OCD, like OCD type disorders, do tend to match a certain pattern of, this is anecdotal, I don't have research to point to this, but it does seem that those match a certain pattern of people who could have been diagnosed as autistic or ADHD or both, but get diagnosed that way instead. So there's definitely a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
I'm of the opinion that there should not be such a thing as a personality disorder as a diagnostic label. I don't think, obviously that matches the lived experience of people, and it's a valid and useful way of talking about things. But because of, I'm getting way far afield already. Because of what we would call bioessentialism, the idea that everything that you experience is due to an inevitable conclusion of your biology. That, for example, a lot of the ways that people will talk about neurotypes is bioessentialism. I was born with this brain. I was always going to be autistic no matter what, which is a valid thing to say. And it's a valid thing to say that that's not the case. We don't have evidence of either one. So whatever a person feels useful, great. But that's where we start to get into some trouble sometimes. This idea that you have to be able to explain every experience you have as the result of some structure, some physiological structure in your brain that we have no evidence of, gets real out there. So all this stuff is really highly medicalized.
Yeah.
And then people spend a lot of time deliberating over, is my experience bad enough in whatever way to count as a, diagnostic symptom? And is my experience of this related to my ADHD or my autism, as though they're root causes of things? And they're not. They're just descriptions of things. We look at patterns. So there's so much overlap between borderline personality, bipolar, ADHD, a lot of the anxiety disorders, autism. There's a lot of people out there are making the argument, especially with autism and ADHD, that they're different manifestations of the same underlying thing, which, again, I don't know if it's a useful idea to everybody across the board or at all, but it's certainly one that can't be disproven because these are all models. These are constructs we're making up. So I just say, to me, those, like a lot of neurodivergent people will draw lines and say, no, personality disorders don't count as neurodivergence, or OCD is not a neurodivergent disorder condition, or whatever. I don't think it's as useful to like draw parameters, around what counts as neurodivergent as what doesn't. In large part because of this. There's so much.
Yeah, and very often somebody who has a diagnosis of, say, OCD will also have a diagnosis of autism or ADHD. So how do you unpick one thing from the other? It's quite fluid. I
quite enjoy seeing people who identify as, online they'll sometimes say AUDHD, AUDHD, autistic and ADHD. I like reading from people who will say, like, what is it to have both? Well, this because of my autism, this because of my ADHD, this, or this experience I attribute to my autism, this experience I attribute to my ADHD, which again is wonderful. Like, that's a huge part of the benefit of having these diagnostic labels, is that then people can use them to explore themselves and start to identify things in different ways. But of course, it's purely subjective. Like, what objective criteria could we look at and say, like, no, this time you were late because of your struggles tracking time from your ADHD. The other time you were late because of your struggles regulating your physicality, and therefore took longer to get ready than you allotted for yourself, which is an autism,
Yeah, and you can get quite caught up in that, trying to figure out, well, why am I the way that I am? And that's useful up to a point.
Yeah.
But if you just keep getting caught in that spiral of rumination, then when you find solutions, and if you need a solution, maybe you just need an explanation. Who knows?
And sometimes that's it, right? Like, sometimes the distress is just experiencing something that you don't understand or can't explain. And as soon as you have an explanation, regardless of whether or not anybody else would agree with it, or there's a way to validate it, with empirical measures or whatever, as long as you have it, then that distress goes away or diminishes. But most of the time, I think we're putting the cart before the horse, I guess, if we're focused on why am I experiencing what I'm experiencing. Because the most important question is, what do I do? Like, here we are. What do I do? What happens next? And then, like you said, exploring the whys is useful to a point. To me, that point is, it's useful to the extent that it's giving us something to look at in terms of what we do next. So either exploring the whys and wherefores and what happened in my past or what's going on with me can be useful if the distress is just about something that you're experiencing but you don't understand. And if you get an understanding of it, the distress will decrease or go away. Or if I can't come up with something to do, or I'm trying to filter through different options of things to do, and then I can go back and look and say, well, here, I've got these 3 options. And if I think that it's because of my ADHD, then I would do option 1. If I think that it's because of my autism, I would do 2. And if I think it was just because it was a hard week, I'll do 3. Then you can go back and say, what do I think it is? But what next is always the most important question.
Yeah.
Because you can't go back. Like, you can't do anything with that information, or whatever you do with that information is about what comes next.
And that brings us to another question that's connected to this, which is, how can seeking or seeing a therapist or coach help you to manage emotional dysregulation?
Well, so with all of this stuff, emotional dysregulation, but any symptom that someone is experiencing, we're talking about two different things. So one I would call coping, the other I would call prevention, meaning when it's happening, what do I do about it? And that's coping. And how do I make it so that it doesn't happen as much or ever or whatever, right? And so the answer to that question varies. Which one should we talk about first, coping or prevention?
Coping, yeah, because I guess once you get that down, then you can start thinking about how to minimize the chances of it happening in future.
Yeah. So when it comes to coping, therapists, that's where they're going to be teaching you techniques, whether that's grounding techniques, breathing techniques, journaling, whatever, exercises, things to do. Because when the experience is occurring, it's especially when it's something like emotional dysregulation, which it takes place in the cognitive environment. It happens internally, right? So if you're emotionally dysregulated, it tends not to be the kind of thing where you're also have the presence of mind to say, now let me think through this and I can use this thought that I've come to recently. Because if you could do that, you wouldn't be emotionally dysregulated. And that honestly is more in that second category. The like that kind of work you would do in therapy is about making it so that you can catch it earlier and go a different direction or address it before it's happening or blah, blah, blah. But once you're emotionally dysregulated, yeah, it's likely that you're going to need just some very simple things, whether that's mindfulness, meditation, whatever. And therapists can teach you that stuff. You can also learn that stuff on your own or from many, many other sources. That's not something that's exclusive to therapy. I think, I don't know how much you know or care about this, Maria, as someone who's not a therapist, but there's a lot of like back and forth. And in particular, there's so many different like theories of therapy. And kind of it's all over it's not like one clear spectrum, but to some extent, psychoanalysis is very far on one end of things where it's very flexible and open to interpretation, difficult to measure and define and long-term and et cetera, where things like CBT, DBT, that kind of thing tend to be on the other end of the spectrum where it's very clearly defined and manualized. It must be done this way, this way, this way, and has short-term and et cetera. They tend to argue with each other. Psychoanalysts don't tend to like the CBT, and CBT practitioners tend not to like psychoanalysts. But I think it's just this. It's like, yeah, psychoanalysis isn't going to do much for you when you are melting down. And CBT can maybe provide you with some tools there. And of course, psychoanalysts can provide you coping techniques and blah, blah, blah. And then the reverse is also potentially true, where CBT might not help as much with changing things in some kind of long-term way where these episodes happen less frequently, where psychoanalysis might. And to be clear, I don't do either of those things. But yeah, for coping, it's really just about learning regulating techniques. And you don't need a therapist to do that, but therapists should be able to help you with that.
Yeah. One thing I use now that I'm more aware of being or feeling dysregulated is distraction. So if I start to, and for me, the big emotions usually tend towards the negative, like sadness or anger. And if I feel myself getting stuck in that, I'll seek out other human voices. So I might stick on a podcast and listen to people talk about something that I've never learned about or I know nothing about, and it gets me out of my head and thinking about the wider world, and it gets me to stop feeling so self-absorbed, I guess. Just thinking about things outside of yourself. Music is another one that I use to pull myself out of it.
For me, and I think similarly, I'm trying to give an answer. Like I hear the question phrased that way about going to a therapist. So I'm trying to answer broadly.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about like my approach or our approach here, what we would do, then some of it, definitely a lot of it falls under that category. Because for the way that we talk about it, emotional dysregulation, or really any experience of intensity when you're talking about that internal environment, right? Whether that's intensely happy or intensely sad or intensely fixated on something or whatever,
Yeah.
That in order to decrease that intensity, it's what we're talking about. Intensity is your attention, your awareness, your resources are being dedicated. A very high proportion of those resources are going to that thing. So you're experiencing it very intensely. And we need to get those resources shifted to something else. So distraction is a great way of doing that. And really all those things we mentioned before, like grounding techniques and breathing techniques, again, they're just different ways of getting you to reallocate some of those resources elsewhere. So for some people, that's going to work most easily for other things to think about. Like for me, I remember back in high school, I identified for myself that if I'm starting to feel like real bad or get into a funk or whatever, that playing a game, reading a book, watching a show or a movie, those are the three things. And it had to be a certain kind. It had to be the kind that for me, I can just kind of sink into the characters, the team. I like ensemble shows and story driven stuff.
Yeah.
And I can't really do that stuff very much anymore. As a parent of 3 young children, I don't have the time to just be like, I'm going to go play a game for 3 hours now. You learn and you adapt. But yeah, some of us, it's give me something else to think about and I'll shift my thoughts. Some of us, or at different times or whatever, it's more about give me something to do so I don't think as much at all. Getting into your body and into the physical environment more. So breathing techniques and, anything that, stimming is a self-regulatory behavior that if I'm doing my stims, and I do, or fidgeting, if I'm doing those things, it helps decrease the intensity of that internal experience. Good or bad. I can get so excited that it feels like I can barely breathe and I have to just kind of yell. Singing is a stim for me.
Yeah, I get that. So we've talked about coping. What about prevention?
So that's when you're getting into the more long-term work. And I'd say there's kind of an in-between where like an exercise that I'll have people do all the time for all kinds of different things. You take a chart, a spreadsheet of some kind. And on the left-hand side, you label 0 to 10. Across the top, the first column, you say things I notice. The second column, things others notice. And the third column, what can be done. So whatever you want to talk about, in this case, we'll use emotional dysregulation, right? That I'm going to say, okay, when I'm at a 0, I'm completely dysregulated. You try and put the thing that you desire to avoid as the low number and the thing you're desiring as the high number. So completely dysregulated is a 0. Totally regulated is a 10. And then that first column, I start to say, okay, what are things that I notice that I've associated with an experience of emotional dysregulation or getting close to it or further away from it? Okay, I start to pace. If I start to pace, that's not like it's terrible, but I'll put that at like, that's like a 6, I'm starting to head into a place where I need to manage it. Mm-hmm. If I'm doing, for me, like this, I'll rub my face a lot. That's like I'm at a 3. That's a sign that we're getting real low, right? Okay. And then the same for what other people notice, because they'll notice things that you don't, right? I notice whenever you start blinking a lot, I get worried about what you're feeling. It's like, oh, really? I didn't know that. And then you start to assign that. And then in that last column, then you say, okay, what are things I can do? Because watching a movie might work for me, or putting on music might work for you if you're at a 7 and it's like going in the wrong direction and you want to turn around early. But when you're at a 1 or a 0, putting on music might not do anything for you at that point. Mm-hmm. So there's that kind of what I would consider like medium term stuff where it's not happening yet, but it's about getting better at recognizing the signs that something might be about to happen so that you can address it as it's coming. And I don't know if everybody would consider that prevention or not. I don't know exactly where that would, because you could say that at 9 it started, right? That only need to be at 10 all the time, but I think that's unrealistic. Otherwise, then yeah, it's about looking at the long-term stuff, meaning if you're getting emotionally dysregulated, it's happening for a reason. Yeah. You're not constantly emotionally dysregulated. No matter who you are not emotionally dysregulated 100% of the time. You are sometimes feel as though your brain is online, So we want to look at what are the things that tend to put you in that place. What are those reasons? We come up, this is like we were talking about earlier. We start to look and make our guesses about why something might be happening, only so that we can test those guesses. Like for me, and I think this is a common pattern, but I don't have like data for this. I'm sure it exists. As the week goes on, like Monday, I'll be all right. Tuesday, all right. Wednesday, okay. Maybe Wednesday evening, starting to get a little tired, whatever. Thursday, it's pretty rough. And Thursday night, like that's my danger zone. If my wife and I get in real bad fights, it's on a Thursday night more often than not. So you look at that and you prepare. Okay, I know Thursdays are rough. What can I do? Or in the course of a day, a lot of us tend to be more kind of composed and in control throughout the day. And then as the evening approaches, we lose control of whatever. And that's when things happen. So what can I do to either prepare for that, know that it's coming, or try and shift things so that it doesn't happen? Like maybe I'm spending way too much of my energy earlier in the day, and by the time I get to the night, I just have nothing left. So then we're looking at what do I do then to make it so it lasts. So again, we come up with theories, but then we test those theories. Well, if it's that, then theoretically doing this would make a change. So I do this and I observe if the change happens or not. And if so, great. And if not, okay, what else could it be? And you just keep going.
Yeah. So it's important to, I guess, to understand that you might not get the answer the first time. Keep working until we find the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell people this ridiculous metaphor, and I'm sure I've done it on stream before, but it's like I keep having this sensation in my gut and my abdomen. It starts out as just a little bit uncomfortable, but over time it gets worse and worse, and it ends up becoming quite painful eventually. It happens all the time, and I tell other people about it, and they said, "Yeah, that's called hunger." The expression, the experience I'm having, they say it's called hunger, and they say that to solve it, you just eat food. So I did. I ate some food, and it worked for a bit. It worked, but then it stopped working. So I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I don't know why everybody else eats food and they're good, where I ate food and I was only good for like a day. And so I don't know what to do next. And don't tell me to eat food because I tried that. It didn't work. That's not work. So what else do I need to do? Right? Like being human just means that there's going to be stuff that changes that you can't predict. Things that work for you will stop working for you. Things that don't work for you will start working for you. There's way too much going on to be able to say with any like precise accuracy, like, yes, this will happen and this will go exactly this way. So yeah, it is a process of just kind of figuring out what works for you, and you don't ever get to be done.
Yeah.
It's a little exhausting.
Yeah.
But
there's no magic answer.
Yeah. A lot of times, especially people who come to like the neurodiversity paradigm for relief, for support, there tend to be expectations that, oh, great, now my problems are solved, right? Like I've been struggling because I'm autistic and wasn't diagnosed, and I was trying to navigate a neurotypical world and do things the way that you're told to do them, but that doesn't work for me because I'm different. Now I know I'm different. Now I want to know how I'm supposed to do those things. Now teach me the rules for people like me. But that's not how it works. Even those normal people rules don't work for everybody. Like whether you believe in neurotypical people or not, and I don't, but whether you do, they still misunderstand each other sometimes. They still misread social cues sometimes. They still can't get themselves started on a project or get distracted. And you'll hear that, right? Like people will say, like, everybody loses their keys sometime. What are you making a big? Because that's that bioessentialism piece again, that binary thing of like, some of us are this and some of us are not. Well, then any argument that can be made of like, that's a universal experience, so I guess what you're saying isn't true. Yeah. But the part that's not true is the binary part, not the fact that some people's experience of it is much more intense or much more impactful or frequent, right? Anyway, I don't know. I don't want people to have expectations that, great, I just learned I have ADHD. Now teach me the ADHD rules so that the rest of my life will be easy and I'll never struggle with getting things done ever again.
Yeah.
ADHD or not.
One session, I'm done. everything's fixed. Hooray.
Yeah.
No.
Like some discrete set of skills. And of course, a lot of neurodivergent people tend to be very rules-oriented people or perfectionists. We tend to be people who push ourselves very hard. That's part of the reason we dysregulate so frequently. It's not necessarily because we're more fragile, but more that we are more willing to expend our resources on things that other people might not think are necessarily worth spending their resources on.
Yeah.
Vigilance and hypervigilance in social situations is an example of one of those things. But also, here's my favorite example. I love using this one all the time. And I think you and I have talked about it, but how much to work. That this is one of those things I think our culture generally, I call this missing the wink. Our culture generally says with a wink, where like everybody's like, yep, you should work 40 hours a week, work 8 hours a day, wink, wink, wink. And everybody knows that you don't actually do that, except some of us miss the wink and we just hear you're supposed to work 8 hours a day. And so we push ourselves to try and work 8 hours straight through, and we get 6 or 7, and then we feel like terrible failures for not doing all 8. And how does everybody else, no one else is struggling the way I'm struggling. How do they all do this? They're not. We have research on this. The average office employee spends 2.5 hours out of an 8-hour day engaged in productive tasks.
2.5. I thought you were going to say 2.5 just sort of faffing about, not 2.5 actually being productive. That's amazing.
It's the wink. Yep, you're one of them. Me too. When I'm at the office, I'm working, because if I wasn't, I'd rather be home with my kids, with my family. So when I'm here, I don't take breaks. And this, I'm not saying this is good. This is not good. This is not like grind hustle culture, like you got to work your butt off. No, this is just the pattern of work that I have gotten into in whatever kind of a way. It is not good. If I'm at the office for 8 hours, I have a hard time remembering to eat lunch. I have a hard time remembering to take bathroom breaks. I have been sprinting down the hall to the bathroom multiple times in the past month. It's not great.
No.
But yeah, to hear that, right? You hear 2.5 hours and just assume that's how much of a break people take. No. Because the 8-hour day, by the way, that was built for physical labor. That can push your body to do repetitive but relatively demanding physical tasks for about 8 hours a day, sustainably, theoretically, if you're well taken care of in between. Not intellectual labor. The brain is not built for that.
Yeah, and I think we underestimate the amount of energy we use when we're engaged in intellectual labor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is like a lot of the reason for the accomplishment equation, why I came up with it originally, is that it's so clear and obvious to me that so much of the problems that people experience in our culture, at least, is due to completely dismissing their own signs of internal distress, right? Because we're told that motivation and laziness and drive and ambition, we're told that these are all things. And what those things mean is when you're feeling tired, when your brain is struggling to focus or struggling to do something, you can just do it anyway. You don't have to pay attention to that. And so we eventually end up deprioritizing that information. Why would I care to know that my brain is tired, that I'm cognitively drained, if I'm supposed to just push through it anyway? Why would that help me? So we just stop paying attention to it altogether. And then we're walking around with our brains shut down for half of the day, not even noticing it. And then emotional dysregulation. One of the most common patterns I see with this is kids who go to school and they're on their best behavior all day. They're focused, they're engaged, they're following the rules, they're listening and responding to people. And certainly sometimes this involves a good amount of masking, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes generally people are engaged in that way. And then they come home and they're absolutely destroyed. And they get home and they're safe and they completely fall apart and get emotionally dysregulated, physically dysregulated. Kids will come home from school and just be bumping into stuff and falling all over the place. And for some reason, then people will say, okay, now you got to do your homework right now. Like you can't take a break and recover for a minute. And then.
Yeah. And like you've you've sent your kid out to do almost an 8-hour workday and then they get to do more work. So they're doing overtime when they get home and they're exhausted.
If adults had to do what kids are asked to do, we wouldn't stand for it. It wouldn't exist. The only reason that school can exist the way that it does is because we don't give children any credence or rights or autonomy.
Yep.
Like any adult out there, if your job, you had to get up, go to work at 7 a.m, whether you like it or not, work until 3 or so. And then most of the time, if you're not taking on additional stuff at work for another 2 or 3 hours in the evening, everybody's going to look at you like you're some kind of loser who's not going anywhere. And then on top of that, when you get home, you got another 1 to 3 hours worth of work that you're supposed to do when you're at home. And there's severe consequences if you don't. And by the way, you have 7 different bosses who all want different things from you.
And don't forget that you have to run around for an hour on your lunch break because reasons.
Yep. And the bosses don't coordinate with each other. They don't check like, hey, are you giving them a heavy thing this week? I'll scale back. In fact, sometimes they coordinate to all give you the worst stuff all at the same time on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Like just the 7 different bosses thing. If I had 7 different people every day telling me different things they needed from me and different ways of communicating with them and tracking things, I'd be done. I couldn't do that. No way.
Yeah.
I would struggle with 2 or 3, you know. But we
I'm
just
kind of there right now, and yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. To me, the emotional dysregulation, as with any kind of dysregulation, is a sign of depletion. That in order to be in control, it takes something from you.
Mm-hmm.
And the more intense some experience is, the more it takes from you to be in control in that moment. Meaning, even if things are calm and easy, it still takes something to be able to stay cognizant and aware and careful. But if things are very hectic, it takes more per moment. And then, we run out. We don't take care of ourselves. We don't rest. We don't step back. We don't say no. We don't allow ourselves to fail or even have the possibility of failure or whatever. And we collapse.
So do you think that ADHD medication, for example, helps with emotional dysregulation? Because I've been wondering about that because since starting meds, I find I don't tend to have as many episodes, but I don't know if that's a combination of meds, learning about myself, my personal circumstances changing for the better in some cases. But I do feel like I seem to be able to very often stop and check myself before I slip into having a bit of a meltdown or something like that.
I mean, that's great. And I'm actually specifically not allowed to talk about people should or shouldn't take medication, which I'm glad for, because I don't think it's something that should be discussed that way by anyone, whether you're a psychiatrist or not. It's an individual thing. I'll say my personal experience is the opposite of yours, that when I started taking medication, I've become emotionally dysregulated far more frequently, and it's been worse when it happens. For my personal experience, I want to be super clear, just talking about my life, not how medication affects people or anything like that. My personal theory is that beforehand, a lot of what was considered to be, laziness or inattentiveness or whatever was really that somehow I was being responsive to my cognitive effort levels, right? That like when I was getting cognitively drained, I did just step back from or stop doing or get distracted by something that's enjoyable or restful or restorative or whatever. And that taking the meds has gotten me to a place where it's harder for me to notice that sometimes. I'll get focused in on something and just keep going.
Okay.
So like I have been irritable. I'm not always irritable, but I've been irritable much more frequently since I started taking my meds than beforehand. I think of it as one of the downsides for me, for sure. But obviously, some people like you have the opposite experience. So I don't really know.
I don't tend to have big hyper focus periods either. I've had a few, So maybe that's the difference too, that I might
Could be.
notice if I'm starting to feel depleted. I might notice it a bit quicker.
And I'm sure we're on different meds and different doses. And of course, even if we're not, we have different biology and physiology and all that stuff. So who knows? But it's certainly something that's worth paying attention to as a benefit or a downside of taking meds. If you're going to take psychoactive meds, I think it's very important that you start to measure and track things in some kind of externally observable way because they're psychoactive. With anything else, I would say, like, yeah, your internal experience is a great way, like I'm happy or I'm scared is totally valid. But if you're doing something that theoretically is supposed to change your experience in here, then it's very hard to compare before and after in that way. So I think it's better to look at, like, how frequently do I snap at people instead of am I feeling irritable or something like that, so that you can track the good and the bad. Sorry, distracted by a text from my wife. It's Halloween in the States. You guys do Halloween?
Yeah, but I live in a block of apartments, so we don't get many trick-or-treaters up here. But I've got some sweets in just in case. I don't end up eating them all myself. But yeah, Halloween it's not that big in Scotland compared to the US, I think.
Yeah.
But Guy Fawkes night, the 5th of November, that's the big night here. So we're going to have fireworks on Saturday. So that should be fun.
See, I'd much rather celebrate somebody who tried to blow up the parliament.
Well, they're celebrating his execution.
Oh, is that what's happening?
Yeah.
Then I'll just have my little secret reason for doing it. Actually, I don't know much about Guy Fawkes. I just know about the gunpowder plot.
Yeah. So yeah, fireworks on Saturday. So it's much bigger than Halloween here, really.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I've got a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old, and so Halloween is like the second busiest holiday of the year for me. It's like large stretches of your life, Halloween is largely irrelevant. You maybe go to a party or something, but other than that, who cares? But when you are a young kid or you have young kids in the States, it's like there's like Christmas than Halloween if you celebrate Christmas,
Yeah, it's big in Ireland too. I guess it originated.
Well, the pumpkin stuff did, from what I understand, the carving pumpkins.
Yeah, but it wasn't pumpkins. It was swedes or turnips or whatever. Yeah.
I've seen
pumpkins
it.
are a fairly new import over here. They're much easier to carve.
Yeah, one of the benefits of being American is just pumpkins everywhere. Much easier. All right, we got 10 minutes or so. What's another question?
Yeah, well, you just mentioned having 3 young kids, and one thing I wanted to ask, if people are watching who are parents of young kids who are prone to emotional dysregulation, or if you have a loved one who's prone to emotional dysregulation or meltdowns or whatever you want to call them, how would you recommend they support their loved one? What can they do to make things a little bit easier for everybody?
So I'll start with coping first, and then we can talk about the other stuff. But coping, so 2 different things. Number one, you can work with the person. You can work with the person that you're supporting or intending to support. My tea is making me burp a little bit. You can work with the person that you're intending to support to develop a list of things that you can remind them of, either as you're noticing something come up. So use that same spreadsheet I talked about earlier, that same chart from earlier, and then you just remind them. You don't make them do anything, because what's difficult when you're getting dysregulated emotionally or otherwise is remembering what things you could do or figuring out something to do in that moment. Coming up with the ideas is very difficult. But if somebody's there to say, okay, do you want to take a hot bath? Do you want to eat something sugary? Do you want to, whatever is on your list? You're not making them do it. You're just offering them the options that you two have discussed in advance, that there's some idea, either based on experience or just some pattern that we're making a guess about, that something here might be helpful. So you can suggest and then support them in doing whatever those kinds of things are. The other thing you can do is provide some sort of sensory modification, modify their sensory experience in some way. So like a very, very commonly helpful one, but not always, with young children especially, is pressure. That like a hug, a tight squeeze, or um, hands on on the shoulders, hands cupped on the shoulders with just a slight downward pressure.
Okay.
That pressure can be helpful. And of course, things like there's like a pill bug on my desk here that's so distracting to me. I'll try not to focus on it, but it's just staring at me. Of course, there's things like getting to a place where it is less sensory overwhelm. That let's get you to a dark, quiet room, or let's get your noise canceling headphones on you. So you can either remove or add something to their sensory experience. Really, like anything you think of, all we're talking about here is soothing, either self-soothing or soothing someone else. So there's a reason that it's a very common stereotype, but very common experience for parents to stroke the head and sing to their young children as a way to soothe them, or to hug and pat and shush them. These are sensory experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So from the outside, in terms of coping, that's it. You either remind them of things that they have found to be useful in the past. Don't try to suggest new things when somebody's dysregulated. Your brain is offline. Call it prefrontal cortex shutdown. You're not learning new things. You just need to get back online first. So reminding them of options and letting them say yes or no, don't push any, or either providing or removing some kind of sensory input for them.
Yeah. I would add, if somebody's in that place, I guess don't take it personally. It's difficult when you're on the outside observing it, but it's best not to take it personally because, as you say, the person isn't in control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's fair or not is
Mm.
not the issue, because it's often not fair. Especially a lot of people have the experience of being a child and it's your parents that are getting emotionally dysregulated. And it is not fair. There's a power imbalance. It should be a parent, not a child, that's taking responsibility for managing. And sometimes that doesn't happen, and it's not fair, and it sucks.
Yeah.
And you still have the options that you have in that context. It doesn't make it okay, but then you figure out what you can do, or you don't. And if you don't have anything you can do, then yeah, that sucks even worse. You're at that person's mercy. It's random and causes all kinds of problems. If you come up with some things you can do, at least there might be some things that you can do. So try not to worry about fairness or equity, or they melt down more than I melt down, this is not fair, or whatever. I mean, really, every fight you've ever been in, like every terrible argument you've had with another person where you're just hurting each other and the relationship is significantly worse afterwards than it was before, you were both dysregulated.
Exactly.
If somebody gets dysregulated and the other person has it in them to be able to stay regulated and work them through it, sometimes that's just by staying fine. I don't need to do anything for you or whatever, but as long as I don't, you're not ruining my day, I do my thing, then you can kind of regulate and come back. But if that second person also gets dysregulated, ain't nothing good gonna happen there.
Mm-hmm.
It gets bad.
Yeah.
I honestly, one of the things that my wife and I have found very recently to be helpful for us in this is to stop talking about it in terms of being angry or sad or whatever, and only talk about it not only, but primarily talk about it in terms of exhaustion or energy or depletion. That instead of when she gets mad at me and I haven't done anything wrong, and then I get pissed because I didn't do anything wrong and now you're getting mad at me, blah, blah, blah. It's not that she's mad at me, it's that she's exhausted. And that gives me a whole different set of reactions, different options to explore, instead of being like, okay, how do I make my argument that I don't deserve to be in trouble for, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some people, for sure, talking will help regulate more than anything. That's always, for me, always been the most effective.
And for me, yeah.
Talk, I regulate better than anything.
Yeah.
Some
There's
people-
some comments coming in from Kitch Squatch. We use the colors of a traffic light for the phases. Don't wait for the meltdown in red. Green is okay. Amber is a warning signal. So have your options ready in the orange time.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Also, I have a freeze frame. I had a freeze frame.
Oh, I think maybe she just means like like we froze.
Okay.
Maybe not. Maybe it's a framework. If it is, let us know. Yeah, that red light, amber light, green light, that's a scale. It's a 3-point scale. And whenever I'm talking to people about scaling, you choose the scale that works best for you, that makes sense to you. You want enough options that you can meaningfully distinguish between different but similar experiences. If I only have angry or not angry, I can only really observe it in that binary way. Am I or am I not? And if I am, and I do anything to try and get rid of my anger and it doesn't get rid of it, then I say it's failed, even if it might have lessened the anger. I don't notice it that way. So I want to have buckets to distinguish. And then, yeah, you don't want to have so many that the difference, like a 1,000,000-point scale, like what's the difference of 1 point from the next? So I tend to use 10-point scales. They're just easy for me. And I think they have meaningful differences between an 8 and a 7 to me. But 3 is great too.
Mm-hmm.
And then the same thing, like you said, she has stuff for the amber light, just like we were talking about, just different stuff for a 4 or a 7 or whatever.
Yeah, I like that. It's nice and neat, I think. We've got a couple of minutes left. There's one other question, but it's a big one. It's kind of a big question, so I don't know if we'll have time.
Yeah, let's lightning round it. What is it?
Yeah. Given the nature versus nurture debate, where do you see emotional dysregulation in that context? Do you think it's more of one versus the other?
All right. Well, my big answer,
matters.
I would say we've already talked a bit about my beliefs on this. And so my number one answer would be, I don't care. I don't care. Doesn't matter. I'm glad that some people care. There is study and research to be done on okay, are there risk factors for a thing that seem to contribute to the development of some pattern that we are looking to? But kind of the whole point of neurodiversity is if we identify, for example, that frequent emotional dysregulation is a problem, and then we identify the reasons that it happens and we address those reasons so that nobody gets emotionally dysregulated like that anymore. Are we not just eliminating a neurotype? What are the other things that went along with being emotionally dysregulated more frequently that we don't know were connected? We didn't establish. We just identified the problematic element of something and tried to eliminate it. What else did we get rid of there? That's a lot of the debate, especially in autism right now, around we want to cure autism. Well, what are you talking about cure? What exactly do you mean? What set of human experiences are you saying we should try to eliminate so that nobody ever has them again?
And that's a slippery slope, right?
So I don't care why. I care that this is where we're at and what do we do about it?
Yeah.
Having said that, I will say that it is always both. It's always both. In what particular ways or in what particular proportions, who knows? Everything you experience is the result of an interaction between you, the individual, and the environment. So starting off as a baby, going to be a lot more of that genetic pre-programmed stuff that's happening. But from the moment you start developing, you start changing. Babies' genetics change while in the womb developing, so I don't know that it's useful to debate too much about which one it might be more of. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, it does.
Question.
And your circumstances keeps changing over the years, so there's no point in getting stuck on that, I think. Because you need to come back to what can I do about it now?
Right. And let's say it's because your mom didn't treat you nicely or your dad was abusive or an alcoholic. Even in that case, even if we could say 1-to-1, that's definitely it. Okay. And what? You still are who you are. Does having that explanation for why you became the way that you are change it for you? So great. And if not, then again, why are we debating it so much? Why are we getting in fights over, no, this is just how my brain is. No, it's because of a set of experience. We got to get wrapping up, but I'll say a place that I see this kind of stuff a lot that's really harmful, I think, is in discussion around trans rights, trans people, transness generally, where if you keep it at the baseline, simple, are there people who have a preference for expressing gender in non-traditional ways for their culture, whatever. That's an unequivocal yes. Doesn't matter how much of a transphobe somebody is, like, yeah, those people exist.
Yeah.
The only thing that they're debating is the reason that somebody might feel that, because of the patriarchy or because of whatever. And what the hell are we talking about at that point? You're going to argue with somebody else about their reasoning? Like, let's just focus on what's happening and what we need to do about it, instead of trying to convince other people that their reasons are wrong or not good enough. Or
by whose standards?
why would you want to take away? This is why we talk about utility, not accuracy. Why would I want to waste any of my very short life trying to take something away from somebody else that's helpful to them, unless there's a reason for it that I can point to and identify, this is why that's a problem. In which case, well, then let's just address what the problem is, regardless of that other stuff. One avenue might be, depending on what thing we're talking about, to get into the reasoning the other person has. But almost always there are other avenues as well. I mean, that's one of the most common things in coaching, right, Marie, is someone comes in saying, I have to get better at going to bed early because they want to not be tired all the time. And that's a theoretically accurate way to do it. But also there's a lot of other things that you could do to be less tired all the time. And to get fixated on one specific one isn't necessarily the best. Just let's add more options to people instead of trying to take options away.
For sure.
Just talking politics at this point. It's all political. The DSM. Anyway, anyone who doesn't bring an awareness of power dynamics into the therapy room or into the coaching session, they just don't know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
It matters.
It does, for sure.
Anyway, having said, I got to go watch my son walk around dressed like a football player.
Oh, cool. Well, I hope you have a really good time. Happy Halloween.
Yeah, thank you.
Hope you get lots of treats.
I'm sure I'll sneak some. I hope you have a good day as well. And I'll see you in a couple of days, and we'll see you all here same time next week.
Yeah, Kitch Squatch, you missed half tonight's broadcast because of that freeze frame. Don't worry, we're going to try and get the broadcast up, get the recording up on Wednesday at the usual time, and possibly Friday as well.
There also should be saved automatically as VODs on our YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube, I don't actually know what the link is. I assume youtube.com/effective artistry, probably, or just search effective artistry on Google. Then you'll be able to watch it there. But we're also going to try and rebroadcast it as though it's a TV show or whatever at certain times. Thank you. Happy Halloween. All right. Thanks, Marie. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And speak to you soon. Bye.